Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Mark Lucas. Subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. I am fascinated by what's happening with Pete Hegseth on Capitol Hill. It's actually why I did a full premium episode on it last week. Journalists here in D.C. are dumbfounded. A week ago, today, nearly all of them were convinced that Hegseth's nomination to serve as defense secretary was dead. Last Monday, the New York Times reported on Senator Joni Ernst's, quote, turnabout, writing, only days after emerging from a private meeting with Mr. Hegseth sounding unconvinced about his fitness to lead the Pentagon, Ms. Ernst, the first female combat veteran to serve in the Senate and a survivor of sexual assault, indicated that a second sit-down had allayed her concerns. Ernst's pivot, the Times said, came only, quote, after days of hectoring and threats by President-elect Donald J. Trump's hard-right supporters who threatened political retribution if she failed to fall into line. The next day, Senator Lindsey Graham said Hegseth's nomination was, quote, much better off this week. Now, 1 week later, the New York Times is running videos with headlines like, quote, how Hegseth salvaged his Secretary of Defense nomination. All that after journalists felt the nomination was so threatened, they were literally asking Hegseth whether he would drop out just 2 weeks ago. Watch this clip of CNN's Manu Raju from December 4th.
Mr. Hegseth, would you consider dropping out?
In late November, pundits were predicting Hegseth's defeat was inevitable. Even Steve Bannon thinks that was the case. Quote, at 4 p.m. on Thursday, Pete's nomination hung by a thread, Bannon told the New York Times last week, referring to Thursday, December 5th. That's when the grassroots kicked in hard. MAGA wants a combat vet who will take on the woke and take on the war profiteers. Bannon's theory of the case is that the MAGA grassroots saved Hegseth. Brendan Buck, who's just about as far from Bannon as you can get as a Republican, actually said something similar over at MSNBC, claiming the threats of a primary challenge worked on Joni Ernst. MAGA media started pushing one point hard that every GOP senator except two voted, as is tradition, to confirm Lloyd Austin, Joe Biden's pick for the same position. Hegseth himself did a media tour and confronted all of the allegations head-on. The rape claim from 2017 in California, the allegation he mismanaged a veterans organization, stories he was drunk on air and in professional settings. The reason all of this fascinates me is because I think, and this is somewhat based on my conversations with Senate staffers over the last week or so, that the ghost of the Kavanaugh confirmation is haunting Democrats. There are honestly some reasonable concerns even Republicans can and do have about Hegseth. If you want him to disrupt the status quo, will it be too hard for an outsider who doesn't know the Pentagon and could be more easily outsmarted by the top brass, who will try to thwart him? Does all his admitted drinking and adultery mean he could be more easily blackmailed by adversaries? Does his lack of experience at a massive organization like the Pentagon matter much, or is it a good thing? But none of those questions really matter anymore because Republican voters saw another anonymous rape claim, along the lines of the Me Too playbook, get tossed into the ring at a key political moment. So they do not trust it, and they expect Trump and his team to go on offense. They won't just dislike someone who caves or gives the appearance of it. They will actively push back on them. And that's what happened with Joni Ernst. This is good and bad. Good because there was a prior standard that did let some people get away with weaponizing flimsy allegations for political expediency. It's bad because sometimes even weaponized allegations raise serious questions, but nobody trusts them anymore. So I thought it might be interesting today, as Hegseth appears to be heading into the holidays on a glide path to the nomination, though that could change, to hear the inside story from a longtime friend of Hegseth, someone who's actually seen inside this confirmation process as a supporter of Hegseth's. I want to hear the case for Hegseth and some of the details about how his nomination has rocked the GOP. Mark Lucas is the executive vice president of the Article 3 Project. He joins us now for some back and forth about who Hegseth is, what his strengths and weaknesses could be, and what the heck is going on over on Capitol Hill. Mark, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's been a really busy couple of weeks for you, I imagine, as somebody with a very, very relevant knowledge to the Pete Hegseth confirmation process. So I just want to start with this question. If you could tell us a little bit about how you know Pete Hegseth, when you met him, and how you've gotten to know him, what kind of guy you know him to be.
I've known Pete Hegseth for over 10 years. We served together in the military. We were both in the 34th Infantry Division, the famous Red Bull Division. Our motto is attack, attack, attack. And Pete and I also worked together at Concerned Veterans for America. He was my predecessor. And at CVA, we were able to pass two of the most historic reforms in the history of the VA. The VA Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act, and then also the Mission Act, which provided veterans choice in their health care. So Pete and I have known each other for a long time. He is a war fighter. He's going to bring much needed reform to the Pentagon, and I believe that he will be easily confirmed as our next Secretary of Defense.
You know, I imagine one of the questions you've been getting a lot, because one of the biggest stories that has come out about Pete Hegseth and this media, it's been a smear campaign. Whether or not people think the smears are legitimate or otherwise, it has been a smear campaign. It's been a drip through the media. And one of the biggest stories has been about him leaving Concerned Veterans for America in weak shape, that he had destroyed the finances and he had been drinking and making staff uncomfortable, and just the place was a mess when it was taken over by you, actually. So you can speak to this. Tell us what the truth is of that story.
Pete left me a world-class organization. Pete had led Concerned Veterans for America and had helped bring thousands of vets on Capitol Hill to be able to really shape the effort that I was able to fall in under, that was able to provide us the opportunity to pass those two historic bills. And so when I inherited CVA, he had an incredible leadership team. He had a great strategy, and he had built a grassroots army. In fact, I was able to go brief President Donald Trump in the Roosevelt Room about our plan to reform the VA, to pass the Accountability Act that I mentioned earlier, but also to provide veterans choice in health care. And the plan I presented President Trump was developed by Pete Hegseth. So a lot of people don't understand that those major policy victories that Trump had in his first term for the VA, they were the brainchild of Pete Hegseth.
Now, how do you think those stories got into the press? Was it people who Hegseth had upset politically, personally, who have an animus against him? Is it people who are loyal to, the status quo? How did those things end up in media reports?
There was a sophisticated media campaign against Pete Hegseth. It started with the New Yorker, and this story was sourced anonymously. Nobody was willing to go on the record and talk about all these concerns they had about Pete Hegseth. And now I'm willing to go on the record with you. I talked to USA Today, I talked to New York Times, and I volunteered to testify as a character witness under oath to tell my story about Pete Hegseth in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee. So we've seen these smears that talk about he was drunk on the job, how he mismanaged CVA, an alleged rape case that the Malibu Police Department didn't pursue. And all of those sources that came forward were anonymous. None of them were willing to put their name or their face on those allegations. And we've just seen this over and over and over again. It's the old Democrat playbook. It goes all the way back to Clarence Thomas. But more recently, the Article 3 Project's founder, Mike Davis, and I, we worked together on the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation. And we started to see that the left was deploying the same tactics. This was Brett Kavanaugh 2.0. And what we learned through that confirmation is we cannot have a presumption of guilt. We live in the United States of America with a Constitution and a rule of law. We believe in due process. And if those accusers believe that Pete Hegseth is such a risk to the Department of Defense, then they need to come forward under oath and bring those accusations, bring those allegations, and they'll be investigated. And I believe that Pete Hegseth has already been exonerated, but we haven't even gotten to the confirmation process. So the left was trying to end this confirmation before it even got started.
What can you tell us about, or what did you learn about Hegseth's management style as you stepped into the role at CVA? Some people are really micromanagers. Some people are really hands-off and like to focus on the big picture. What kind of leader do you know Pete Hegseth to be, and what could that tell us about how he'll lead the Pentagon?
Pete Hegseth and I were both infantry officers. We served as platoon leaders. Pete was in Iraq and Afghanistan. I led an infantry rifle platoon along the Afghan-Pakistani border in 2010 and 2011. Those were the deadliest years of the war. So our combat leadership really shapes how we manage organizations. And Pete is a warfighter first. He's also comes from a junior officer background, which means he's very close to the men that he served with. He's not like these colonels or these general officers. He really represents the warfighter. So that experience really shaped his leadership at CVA. He traveled all across the country. He built a grassroots army. I brought Pete to my home state of Iowa during the Iowa caucus. We live broad streamed or live broadcasted my caucus location, and he was able to connect with Iowa caucus goers. I brought a couple younger enlisted soldiers to meet Pete. He could cut it up like he was one of the guys, but he also has great vision. And so just like he can connect with lower enlisted, he will also be able to go to the Pentagon with his academic pedigree, which, by the way, he went to Harvard and he went to Princeton, and he'll be able to run circles around these Pentagon officers and also these defense contractors when it comes to in-depth policy conversations.
You know, he's been pretty open. He says he knew that some of the stuff was going to come out, but he's been pretty open about his struggles to stay faithful, his struggles with alcohol. He absolutely denies the rape allegation, but has talked about, this has been a problem for him personally, the struggles to stay faithful. How do you understand those in the context of the guy that you know? What is this something that's post-war that it's one of the things about coming back from war, you're just dealing with so much pain and stress. What's going on as you see it?
All of my interactions with Pete have been totally professional. And we also have had beers together after a meeting at the White House. So I've been with him both in a professional and also in a personal setting. And I didn't see any indicators that he had a drinking problem. Now, many of us after war did come home, and I know I'm not breaking any news, but infantry soldiers tend to like to drink beer, right? And he's acknowledged that some things have happened in the past with his drinking and with his infidelity. But if the United States Senate really wants to become the morality police, and if drinking and womanizing is disqualifying behavior to serve in government, we're going to have a lot of senators out of a job in Washington.
Well, that's for sure. But on that note, is there any concern? I don't know, I may actually be completely out on a limb here, but is there any concern that in a position like head of the Pentagon, there are things that could be used as compromise? I mean, that's something that's come up in other people's confirmation processes or just putting them in high-level foreign policy positions. Is that a concern that you have heard raised as you've been hearing about the confirmation process and having some of the conversations like these? Are senators concerned about that? Are you concerned about that at all?
Not with Pete Hegseth, but I am deeply concerned with people that have been compromised in the Pentagon, in the FBI, in the DOJ under Joe Biden's administration. And what we're seeing from the mainstream media is they're trying to project all of this bad behavior on Trump nominees when in fact, they're the ones who are conducting this behavior. It was Joe Biden and Hunter Biden and the rest of his family that was compromised by receiving money from some of our adversaries, by having financial investments in Ukraine. Those are the people that are compromised that really put our national security in jeopardy. We've almost went into a war supporting Ukraine against Russia. Joe Biden and his family, with their business interests, have really put the American people at peril. So I would say that the Biden administration, Kamala Harris, the DOJ, there's a lot of people in there that have been compromised, and they'll be held accountable. Just like Joe Biden said, nobody is above the law. I agree with that. And the Article 3 Project, our founder Mike Davis and I, we're going to investigate a lot of the bad deeds that were done within the Department of Justice. But the transition to Pete Hegseth, I see nothing in his background that would lead to him being compromised. I know that the Pentagon is fearful of Pete Hegseth because he's never worked for a defense contractor. He's not a part of the club. He can't be bought out. There's nothing that Pete has that they can take away from him. Pete wants to serve President Trump. He wants to fulfill this America First policy agenda. And I look forward to the change that he's going to bring to the Pentagon.
I mean, his outsider status, I think, at least from my perspective, is just a huge advantage coming in. On the other hand, Alyssa Farah, a very anti-Trump host at the View, made kind of an interesting point, and you mentioned this earlier, that Hegseth would, quote, run circles around the generals at the Pentagon. Alyssa says, even the best people can't run circles around the generals at the Pentagon because they know every inch of that department. They have spent years inside of it. It is a club, to the point you just raised. So to what extent, or do you think he really would be able to run circles around people who are going to be trying to thwart him basically at every step if he disrupts the status quo? Like, is that realistic?
Pete and I are both citizen soldiers. So we served in the National Guard. That 34th Infantry Division, the Red Bull Division, Pete was in the Minnesota Guard. I was in the Iowa Guard. And we deployed to Iraq, we deployed to Afghanistan, and we saw the failure of our nation's leaders in the Pentagon. Pete and I and our men, we never lost a battle, but those generals have lost the war. I like to put a finer point on this. When I went to Afghanistan, it was in 2010, and we were surging forces 9 years after the attacks of 9/11. And I was young, I was in my 20s. I was a platoon leader, a junior officer, but it did not take me long to discover that we were losing, and there was no plan to win. It was a part of their strategy. The longer and the bloodier the wars meant more recurring revenue for those defense contractors. Winning was never a part of the game. Also, the Department of Defense, they failed 7 audits in a row. So this idea that these general officers and these senior civilians are smarter than Pete, that they're smarter than the grassroots, is completely out of line with the mainstream. I believe that we're going to see that Pete's going to go in there. He's going to be able to reduce cost. He's going to be able to refocus our forces, and we're going to come out stronger.
There was an op-ed in the Free Press this week. I don't know if you saw it, but they sort of suggested that Pete Hegseth is part of a movement to bring the culture war into the Pentagon, which I personally find laughable because the left brought the culture war into the Pentagon, and even the center and some people on the right brought the culture war into the Pentagon. But the op-ed said the challenges facing the Department of Defense have never been greater. We face myriad enemies across the globe, from Putin to Xi to the Ayatollah, and then continued to say Hegseth and his quote-unquote war fighters, which is a word that you've used just in this conversation, Mark, wish to prosecute a culture war. And in doing so, he will set America on course to lose the next real one. What do you say to that? Are you signaling, when you call him a war fighter, something cultural that is bringing kind of MAGA into the Pentagon in a way that's not refocusing its mission in a sort of business, getting down to business and defeating our enemies way, but actually on a sort of internal domestic culture war way?
I've served under 4 different presidents: George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. And I've never seen more of a culture war waged than I did under Joe Biden. Even between George W. Bush and Barack Obama, I didn't see a whole lot of change. Barack Obama pretty much upheld the status quo. But underneath Joe Biden, there was DEI introduced. There's all of this transgender chaos introduced. And so Pete Hegseth just wants to return our military back to the fundamentals. We need to restore lethality to our military. When Pete and I, as warfighters, served overseas, we did not have time to focus on frivolous matters. So we would train our men on what I called the big 4: shoot, move, communicate, and stop bleeding. As an infantry soldier, you have to focus on winning those battles that are right in front of you. And you don't have time to worry about DEI, transgender surgeries, or understanding white rage. So what you hear from the mainstream media is, again, projection. They ran rampant into DOD for 4 years. We're just trying to return to the norms, but also maybe go a step further. A lot of Republicans in Congress would say, well, we want to cut taxes. We want to reduce spending and regulation, but don't touch our Pentagon. Don't touch the NDAA. Well, no, we have to reduce our budget because we have unsustaining deficits that we're running year over year. And when I returned home from Afghanistan, the greatest national security threat at that point was our national debt. So I believe that Pete Hegseth will be able to return us back to fundamentals, reduce spending, and actually make the world safer.
You said something so interesting earlier, which is that this was Kavanaugh 2.0. And I've been fascinated by what's happening on Capitol Hill, where you had Joni Ernst signaling hesitation and then signaling support. You're still playing it a little careful, but you've seen this process playing out up close. You've had a front row seat to it. What changed? Why are some senators seeming to get on board with Pete Hegseth when before they were a little cautious? To me, I'll just put this on the table. I think the campaign sort of backfired. I think it felt so much like a Kavanaugh situation that people's constituents were saying, you can't cave. And they knew their constituents wouldn't want them to cave to these media criticisms and allegations. And Hegseth sort of came out, went on Megyn Kelly, went on Fox. His mom went on Fox, faced them head on. You guys have been out here defending him. That's sort of my perspective on what happened, just being aggressive, not backing down. It sort of set a tone that helped make comfortability, change the comfortability in the Senate. Can you tell us a little bit of your perspective actually seeing this up close? What happened?
With Brett Kavanaugh, President Trump had already been in office for a while. So the Senate was in session. They were able to go through the confirmation process. Here in 2024, we were in the lame duck session. So you're in that period after the election until January where there's still senators traveling to DC. There's still work that's being done in that lame duck. And President Trump was moving at light speed. And he had introduced so many nominees that it caught the press somewhat flat-footed. But I think Republican senators were also not able to keep up. And so what they saw was that President Trump was very popular. He won in a historic landslide. President Trump won every critical swing state, and he had a mandate. But you also saw the grassroots were very engaged. The Article 3 project, we have never seen this level of activity in the month of December. It's our biggest month historically. We sent over 50,000 messages from grassroots activists all across the country into these Senate offices. So these senators, I don't think were truly prepared. And then also Kash Patel, Pete Hegseth, these nominees are very popular. And now the Senate is starting to come in line. They're starting to see the popularity, but also they're trying to speed up some of these meetings as well. Like with my home state senator, Joni Ernst, she's known Pete Hegseth for a long time. She's had multiple meetings with him. And it did not surprise me that she wanted to take time and do her due diligence because she survived sexual assault herself. And we saw this with her with Brett Kavanaugh, and we really respect the Senate's advise and consent process. And the grassroots, though, were ready to engage. They want support of all Trump's nominees because they believe, and I support them in this, that President Trump has a mandate.
Now, one of the most interesting things that can happen to an American is to see, when you have inside knowledge of a situation, what you are seeing with your eyes and your experience versus how the media is telling that story in real time. So just on a personal level, Mark, what has it been like to kind of have the scoop and see what's happening and then read about it in the media? I mean, I was looking this morning, there was a Puck News piece that said Trump was upset about these reports of Hegseth drinking. That was the thing that was maybe the straw that was about to break the camel's back. This was a week ago. We saw many stories like that. Just, a week from when we're talking right now, it was like everyone here in DC was like, Hegseth, he's gone. He's cooked. It looks like they're done with this nomination. We're sitting here today, and that's not true at all. So what has that been like?
You're absolutely right. Kash Patel and Pete Hegseth, those nominations were dead on arrival, according to the mainstream media. But A3P quickly went to action. We leveraged our grassroots, and we saw that no, those nominations aren't actually DOA. They are very, very popular with the American people. And it meshes up with what we've seen with public opinion polling that Donald Trump, his approval has never been higher. And the American people also approve of his transition. And we're starting to see also with the grassroots, they approve his nominees. Washington is out of touch with America. We've known that for a long, long time. They live in this bubble, and there's still Republican congresspeople that believe in the Washington Post or CNN. and they're in that echo chamber, and they start to hear these accusations from the New Yorker, and they start to panic. When the grassroots people all across America said, no, we support Donald Trump, we believe in his nominees, we actually like the direction of Kash Patel and Pete Hegseth, we believe in what they want to do at the FBI, at the Pentagon. And after the dust settled, these politicians started to come in line because they saw that, no, the American people support these nominees.
Last question. I know you know Dan Caldwell, great guy. And he posted after Pete Hegseth's nomination was announced, basically just, listen, if you think this guy is a neocon, you're wrong. He was like, basically, there are a lot of things people can say about Pete Hegseth, but he's not a neocon. American on the right, the foreign policy sort of consensus has shifted. Ukraine and Israel are the two big places, obviously, given the hot wars that are happening there right now. What kind of foreign policy would Pete Hegseth bring to the table? It's one thing to sort of talk about it in media. It's another thing to actually have to make these big decisions. So is he sort of America first? Is he realist? How would you define him?
Very few people know Pete Hegseth better than Dan Caldwell. He served as the policy director for Pete. I retained Dan Caldwell. He is one of the brightest minds there is, not just on veterans policy, but also on national defense. I retained him as my policy director. He helped me tremendously. And I agree with Dan Caldwell. Dan is also a pipe hitter. He was a Marine. He was an infantry soldier or infantry Marine, outstanding caliber. And so Pete, Dan, and I all agree that we have to have more restraint with our foreign policy. We don't subscribe to these neocon philosophies that we need to go to war with everybody. We want to be very focused on what the military is doing. We want to refocus our efforts inside the Pentagon. We want to be able to reduce spending. We want to be able to smartly reduce our footprint around the world, because we believe that this imperial power the United States has demonstrated around the world hasn't made the world safer. In fact, we're living in some of the most volatile times in world history. So I agree with Dan Caldwell. I know Pete Hegseth personally. He is not a neocon. We were very energetic in our service in Iraq, in Afghanistan. We want to take the fight to the enemy. We thought that these radical terrorists needed to be held accountable for 9/11. But now that we can look back on that service, I'm a father of 3 young children. I look back at my time in Afghanistan with pride, but also I've learned a lot. And that we need to reduce this footprint. We need to be hyper-focused on rebuilding this America First policy agenda, and that will make us safer. President Donald Trump proved that. I volunteered to serve in South Korea at the height of the crisis with Kim Jong-un. I went to the peninsula. I saw Donald Trump's America First foreign policy up close and personal. He talked to Kim Jong-un personally. I thought we were heading to war. Every day in South Korea, I reported to an underground bunker. I remember looking at satellite imagery of North Korean soldiers' faces. I felt war was imminent. But because of Donald Trump and his foreign policy, he was able to de-escalate the situation, and he completely changed the dynamics on the Korean Peninsula. Pete Hegseth adopts that same foreign policy vision, is going to make the world a safer place. And I cannot wait to see Pete Hegseth serve as our next Secretary of Defense.
Mark, thank you so much for your time. This was very interesting. We appreciate you stopping by.
Thank you for having me on.
So I could have kept talking to Mark about all kinds of different issues. This is a really interesting nomination on a policy level and sort of on that meta media, what's happening to the GOP level. Obviously, Mark is somebody who very much supports the Hegseth nomination. I don't need to reiterate that. It was very clear. But I also appreciated his willingness to ask questions, to answer questions, one of which about blackmail, for instance, I haven't seen really raised. I was pretty curious if that was something senators were talking about. Seems like a pretty obvious question to me, at least. So Mark's willingness to go back and forth a little bit on that, even how he knows Hegseth amidst all of these rumors and innuendo about his drinking, his sleeping around, all of that. It was good to hear some insight from somebody who's very much backing him, but also knows him. Because again, on so many levels, this is interesting. I mean, never before, really, that I can think of in recent history has someone so outside the establishment been picked for such a big position when it comes to American foreign policy. I mean, this is just, it's hard to even wrap your head around how huge the Pentagon is in terms of like the many dollars, taxpayer dollars it controls, its influence over the entire geopolitical situation worldwide. This is so significant. It's important to ask some of those questions. It's important to hear the case out. And it's fascinating to see how the Republican Party reacted once again to hearing from its own base. It actually reminds me a little bit, in a weird way, this is not a perfect parallel, but of what happened on January 7th, 2021. Because on January 6th, Republicans who would sort of talk tough about Trump behind closed doors and be like, yeah, I can't wait till this guy is out of here. They thought they had the opportunity to impeach him, get rid of him, purge him from American politics. And they were, in a way, it was January 6th was sort of like a bittersweet day. And to the extent it was sweet at all, it was because, hey, we can finally wash our hands of Donald Trump. Well, by the next day, it became clear that's not what their voters wanted them to do. And it sort of reminds me of what happened with Pete Hegseth. You sort of saw Joni Ernst raising what I thought were some reasonable questions. Now, was she raising them for the right reasons, or because she is, someone who's very defensive of the Pentagon establishment? That's another point entirely, another conversation entirely. But there are significant questions about putting an outsider in this role. I understand it. So all of that is to say, she tested the water and got a very firm response very quickly. It took just a few days for the entire narrative on this to shift. And I think that was partially, we're doing an anatomy here, and that's what Mark was helpful in sort of understanding, an anatomy of the media campaign, an anatomy of the Republican response to it, and how those two things work together. So it's, this would have not happened before the Kavanaugh allegation is essentially what I think. It definitely would not have happened before Donald Trump. Hegseth's nomination probably never would have even been made is one thing, but if it had, it would have been tanked by these very, very salacious stories like immediately. And not only was it not tanked, but it seems like, Hegseth has even more support now than he did before. There's a sort of loyalty to him. He's a litmus test. So it's been very interesting. And to compare it with what happened to Matt Gaetz, I think, Trump wants the DOJ, Gaetz himself wants the DOJ to be thoroughly magnified on day one of the administration, and knew that the confirmation would probably just take a really long time, and there wasn't a chance it wouldn't have gone well. So that was more pragmatic. But in this, I think, it tells you how, I guess, wedded to the MAGA base the Republican Party is now. And if you're a Republican, you just say, that's great. If you're a MAGA Trump supporting Republican, you say, this is great. These are politicians like actually listening to the base, listening to their voters, as opposed to listening to the lobbyists from the defense contractors and people who have worked at the Pentagon for decades who are telling them this is dangerous, don't do it. On the other hand, there is something that gets lost, of course, when it just becomes impossible to cede on any allegation whatsoever. Like, there's this reflexive litmus test that comes up. So all that is to say, Mark is really interesting. The work they're doing is really interesting. I really appreciated him coming here and answering some of these questions, and appreciate you for watching. So we are here every day, Monday through Friday. Please subscribe to the Undercurrents channel. Please subscribe wherever you download your podcasts. And of course, over at undercurrents.tv, if you want the full premium experience of the show, where actually I fleshed some of this out in even more depth last week in a monologue. You can get that behind the paywall. So thank you so much for tuning in, and we will be back soon with more.